Well, hello YouTube, and welcome back to another episode of this old planer. Today we're going to be making the pins that hold the gears onto the side of the planer for the feed drivetrain. And as you may remember from those of you who have been following along in this series, there was a little bit of damage on the pins. Let's see, I'll try and get this in here close enough to where you can see it. Now there was a grease cup on here that you actually, I'll show you that again later, that you twist the cap on, you fill the cup with grease, twist the cap on, and it forces the grease into the groove here. And on this side of the pin with the groove, the wear is, this is the direction of rotation. So the wear was actually, not too bad. But as you get around on the back side, there wasn't much of a grease film here left. And so we see a little bit of wear, a little bit of excessive wear on the pin, and that's why I'm going to replace them. Now, granted, I could reuse these. They're not so badly worn that the gears wouldn't run true, but on the one side of it, the chatter will be getting to the point where it'll start prematurely wearing off the gear teeth. One gear, one little small spur gear is showing excessive wear, and so I'm going to go ahead and just remake that one in addition to the one I already made for the thing. You just saw that in the last episode, and so I'm trying to avoid getting too crazy about this, because one, I don't have the material to make a big spur gear, and just in case that one of them goes hen shit on me. So the wear on the big spur gears actually looks pretty good because they're running quite a bit slower, and the individual teeth make contact with the follow-up gear a lot less than the small spur gears do. So those small spur gears are going to wear out a lot quicker than the big ones will, just by virtue of the fact they have less teeth and they make contact with the other gear more often. So that's why I'm going to go ahead and make that new spur gear. I don't know if I'll show that in an episode or not. Kind of the same old routine it was before. It's a 13-tooth gear, just like the last one, slightly smaller. Yada yada yada. 32 millimeter bore on the thing, and so forth. But anyway, we have here a nice piece of chrome moly stock here that we're going to be using to turn 3 of these new pins. And we're going to grind them, and then we're going in addition to this one groove, we're going to go ahead and drill all the way through and put a second groove on the other side so that the gear can pick up enough grease and maintain enough of a lubrication film to where we don't see, well, let me try and get you in here. There's a pretty nasty gash in here where the thing had galled, and prevent this wear pattern like this from reoccurring. So got the dimensions. It's just a straightforward process. The only thing different is interestingly enough, got a standard thread on here, a pipe thread. This is I believe a 1/4 inch. I've got the tap for it and the corresponding drill to tap it with, and we'll just have to tap and drill and make a pin. We're going to have a wider flange on this time, to where we get an additional lubrication film between the flange and the gear, so when the gear wanders slightly on the shaft and the lubricant starts to squish out, we don't see too much wear on the mating surfaces of the gear. That's one of the things I did notice tearing down the drivetrain, is that I was seeing a little bit of well, not really a distinct wear pattern, but you can see there's a shiny spot, a shiny ring on the gears where they were rubbing on this flange. So I want to make it a little wider and make sure that there's enough lubricant in there to where they don't, one, chowder the pin, or start getting excessive wear on the flange of the gear. So here's my setup here. Got the ring of fire on here. This is a 50 millimeter shaft, so we're only going to be taking off 18 millimeters, so that's 9 millimeter on the diameter. We're going to be doing some tricky stuff here later on. What I did to get the center holes drilled, because this won't quite go through the chuck all the way, there's Morse taper in the bottom of this chuck, and so what I did is I just shoved the shaft in as far as it could go, tightened her up, and you know, for the purposes that we're going to be doing, you know, just drilling a center hole to run it between centers, accurate enough, because we're going to be accurizing this portion of it anyway later on with the grinder. So that's the reason we did it that way. So let's set this up to full speed, and away we go. I've already set my travel dial over here. I'm just touching off now to get a feel for the depth that I need to go. Okay, there's a touch off. So we're going to take 2 millimeters initial cut. There's one, there's two. Been a lot of chatter. That was to be expected. Got so much overhang here that there's just no other way around it. I could take a lighter cut on the next go around and we'll probably fare a lot better. So now I'm past. So now I'm up to 139, back her off. I think I'm only going to go 1 millimeter this time and see how it behaves. Same old, same old. So we'll go ahead and do 2 millimeters and throw some coolant on it and see how it goes. Okay, we're getting close to final dimension. I'm still getting a little bit of chatter here. Shaft is quite warm in spite of the coolant. What happened with the chatter here, when it got real bad, is the castle nut for the clamping mechanism of the tailstock had worked loose, and the lever was camming over, and so it wasn't holding the tailstock quite hard, you know, quite good enough, and so it was chattering loose, and of course the whole thing started chattering, and you guys saw what the end result was. So it didn't have any bearing on the tool itself. It was strictly on the lathe itself. So let's see, we are at 33 and 4/10. So we're going to go ahead and take off another half millimeter. I'm going to sneak up on it here and then you know, get a good final measurement. I got to wait for this to cool down. I'm probably going to run the coolant real hard on it this time. Might even slow down the RPMs a little to get a halfway decent finish. This is going to get ground anyway, so the final dimension is going to be a little over, a few tenths over actual size to facilitate the grinding. So let's see there what we can do here. Yeah, 32.3. The shaft is still quite warm. We'll throw the coolant on it separately and then see how that makes it see how that affects our final size. And if I had to guess how warm the shaft was, it was somewhere probably in the neighborhood of 40 C, maybe 50. Just hot enough to be able to touch. Okay, now we're room temperature here. Doesn't take long to cool these things down. Let's see how much much of a difference that made in size. Till it made a little bit of a difference. I've got about 3/100ths less. So I'm going to go ahead and take another cut of about about 1/10 of a millimeter, 1/10 and a half, and probably color it good. Oops. Sneak underneath the camera here so you guys can get a good view of it. So here's a finished or semi-finished part. Give it a real light chamfer here on this shoulder. Ran the tool in just slightly bit here because we won't be able to get the grinding stone all the way, the grinding wheel all the way in here. So this is a compensation for that shortfall on the grinder, the tool post grinder that I have when I'm grinding at an angle. I don't have a stone big enough to where I can actually grind a right angle. I'll try and work that out someday, but for right now I'm just going to go ahead and use it the way it is. Then I got a chamfer up here on this end, and I'm going to leave this rough for now because later the face of this is going to have to get faced off and drilled, and for the grease zerk, and also for the grease passages. And so until then, I'm not going to grind this. I'm going to grind this after I drill through, get the grooves cut and the whole shebang, and then go from there, because that way the finish won't be too affected by the the tooling marks and so forth. Because when I chuck this up, I'm going to have tooling marks on it from the chuck, yada yada yada. You guys will see that as we go through the steps. And so that way I don't have to worry too much about, pecker tracks all over this thing. And then once the thing's when all the machining steps have been completed, then we're going to grind it. So anyway, now it's time to part this off and excuse me, and cut it off, and then move on to the next part. So bring you guys back when we get ready to move on to the next steps in machining. These are just going to be, the next two are rinse and repeat of this. Just shorten it up, yada, yada, yada. Okay, here's our last piece of shafting here in the chuck right now. Got to take this down to 9.7 millimeters. That's what our first one ended up being. So we're going to take them all three down to that same dimension, just because. Then we'll have to redo our tap hole here. Or the center hole, and put a little chamfer on it. So we got to take off 13.5 millimeters, and I'll do that in 2 millimeter increments on this go around, and we're going to shave it off this way. So anywho, let's let it rip. I got my travel dial set already to where there we go. There's 2 millimeters set on the dial. Okay, now we're ready to move over to the mill and cut in our grease groove, and then also the pressure surface that we have. Like on this one right here, this is where the bolt that holds this whole thing in the machine mates to the surface of the pin. And then we're going to mill this grease slot in here too. I have a 2 millimeter diameter. This is a 4 here from the looks of it, and I thought it was a tad bit too big because the hole here is 4 millimeters in diameter, but then the two branches are a little too big to feed an adequate amount of lubricant to the shaft. So we're going to make this a 2 millimeter wide, still maintain a 4 millimeter hole on both sides through and through, and then a 2 millimeter feeder bar in order to get lubricant to the shaft, to the gear. So there we go. Now we're all ready to mill her out, and then you can see the pecker tracks here on the shaft, and that's going to all get ground out. We're 2/10 of a millimeter oversize, and so all that stuff will disappear with the grinding, and then we'll have a nice smooth shaft. So now here we've got our workpiece all set up in the vise. Now we got to do some edge finding here. We're going to grab the center of the piece off of this end and then go in 40 millimeters, 45 millimeters from the other end to, grab the point of reference for our center hole. Okay, got 0. Setting 0 on the dial. Run it back and check it again to make sure that it's still on 0. And we're slightly off. Check it again. And there we are. So 2 out of 3 ain't bad, as old Meatloaf likes to say. So now we're going to go up here and check our Okay, there's 0. Back it off, try it again. And we're dead money, so dead nuts. So we'll go ahead and take this out. Zoom you out here. A little bit of Wiener slider and off. So here's the choice why we stuck shaft in the shaft in the dividing head, and using the drill chuck to hold the bit, although that's not the primary reason for that. So now we can just rotate this whole thing at 180 degrees, and I'm using the dividing plate here on the back of the chuck. So technically, if I wanted to, I could put however many grooves on the face of this as I wanted to, providing there was holes for it to exit, for the grease to exit. So now we can bring our tool back down. Made contact, meter slider, rip 'ems, and raise the head. Did a lot of setup here. We're going to mill in this little slot here on the shaft. So we're going to take our depth mic here and just kind of straddle it. Try to eyeball it to get it to where it's about center and vertical or perpendicular to the cut. And then this is kind of tricky, so you got to use a little bit of feel. And we've got 1.25 millimeters, which is how much we're going to, once we make contact here, we're going to raise the table 1.25 millimeters. So now we got our pin set up in the vise, 20 millimeter end mill here. I marked this with a Sharpie. I don't know if you can see that or not. Just kind of marked it approximately where the other slot is on the other pin. They're both pins are slightly different, so we're just going to go ahead and touch off, and then raise our table up 1.25 millimeters. Still coming up. Okay, we just touched off. Set 0 here. There's our pin. Okay, this is a grinding procedure here, so it doesn't really take that much pressure to hold the work in the between the centers and then power it. There's just very little tool pressure from the grinder on the works, so we can go ahead and just run it without a dog. And yeah, take a measurement here and see where we're at. There's 32.25, 32.15. So we got a tenth of disparity between, between here and here. So I'm going to have to kind of watch that for a little bit, see how this thing behaves. It might be in the ways, it might be in the tailstock. I've been having trouble with this thing all week, so I'm thinking it's probably in the tailstock. Well, YouTube, now we got our pins all done, so that's a wrap for this episode of this old planer and getting pinned. So next step is going to be putting this all back together. Well, actually I got to do some de-rusting first, and then still got to do some work on the feed rolls. But as far as that goes, the gear train is just about ready to put back together. So when get on to the next step here, which is again the one bed plate. I got to upgrade that, do some improvements there to the roller suspension that goes in there. That's going to be up next. But then it's on to de-rusting and putting the whole old grower back together. So anyway, if there's any thoughts, suggestions, critiques, by all means, put them in the comment section below. Love to hear from anybody that has thoughts or ideas that might improve the process here and make things go a little smoother and a little better. So with that, we'll see you guys again soon.